Welcome to Sabbath School, and we trust that the time we're able to spend together in this preliminary part of the Sabbath School, as we call it, before we break off for our lessons, will be a time in which we can just be a little bit inspired about our concept of mission and how that actually started here in Australia. So let's just bow our heads and we're going to have a word of prayer. Our Father in heaven, I pray that as we just share together, that you would guide and direct in what we share, that it will be a blessing and there will be an awareness and a sense of mission that our church in this country and in the original country in which we were founded on. And I just pray that you would guide us and direct us in that regard. We thank you, Lord, that the Sabbath School recognises that we are a church that is very much aware of mission fields and aware that we're able to contribute and be a part of sharing the gospel to all the world. Because when it's done, we know that Jesus will come, and that we look forward to. So I pray that you'd be with our Sabbath School divisions today too, with the children, with the young people, the connections group, and each of our classes. May we all be blessed today as we spend this time in understanding your purpose for us. I pray in your name. Amen. I couldn't believe it when I looked down just then to see that this was 30 years old. I was doing a preliminary paper to my final paper for my master's, and it was to be a 10,000 word research project and so on. And so it was produced, but when I did the word count at the end, it was long enough to be the final paper. In fact, the marker, a Dr. Down at the Melbourne College of Divinity, he actually said, this really is your final paper, so just tweak it a bit and it'll do. Well, I didn't take his advice at all, and I had another topic already underway, so I kept working on it, and it took years and years of time, and I just wished I'd stayed with it. But anyway, so it's called The Arrival and Development of Adventism in Colonial Victoria, 1885 to 1900. All right, so that 15-year period is what I was focusing on, and I had to be using as many primary sources as we could. Obviously, I used many sources of people who had already spoken and written on our early church history. But two of the very original sources, and I had others as well from the Science Publishing Company and other places, but two of them that I got, I actually was able to photocopy them and bind them together in my own little copy now of, one is the first Sabbath schools and the minutes of those meetings that were held here in Australia. And it lasted, I think this particular lady, I think was for about, is it just on 15 months or so, she was the Sabbath School secretary and she wrote up these minutes. And it was just for me a minefield of ideas that I was able to use and cross-reference with other things as well. The other one, which we won't be making any reference to, is the Hawthorn Church minutes from 1894 through to 1905. And again, quite valuable in putting together this whole history here in Victoria. So it began with, as you see here on the screen, it began with a desire to try and find out what really happened, through primary sources. All right, and as you can see here, it's the mission that started in Australia. 1885 is the date for when these 5 missionaries arrived here. And they arrived here because before them, in fact, it was 10 years before them, in the year 1875, that Ellen White actually was meeting with, it is believed that it was the Battle Creek congregation, and she was talking about the printing press. And she was sharing with them a vision that she'd had the previous day. And that vision was saying that she saw printing presses operating all around the world. And she had very clear pictures of these printing presses that she saw operating. And she was sharing this when her husband and Elder Haskell, we know is another one of the men you saw there a moment ago, was also in the group up front with her. And her husband, interrupting, said, what were some of those countries? And the answer that he got was, I can't remember. Oh, hang on. There was one. The angel said Australia. Have you read Ross Goldstone's book? That's the title of his book. And he went on to talk about that event and, of course, the history that followed that event. And so this is now looking at something that Ellen White had made a comment 10 years before it actually happened, and it had already been in the mind of Stephen Haskell as well. He wanted a mission here in Australia, and he wanted to be going there, but the Americans over there, they kind of gave him a bit of a hard time. Do you really want to go down and convert those kangaroos, they said? And that was the attitude by much of the church until Ellen White gave the endorsement. And so by the year 1885, these 5 men and 2 women and 4 children, 6 extras, set out for Australia. And you can see there's Elder Stephen Haskell. He was the coordinator, if you like, and the administrator and an evangelist as well. Elder John Corliss, he was the major evangelist in the group, and maybe we'll get a chance to just touch on him briefly at one stage. And their 2 children, his wife, never picked up her name everywhere. It was always sister and brother, all right, but got the children's names, Lulu and Burr. And then, of course, there was another pastor, a pastor Israel, his wife and 2 children, and they were a little bit older, by the way. In fact, Jessie was well into her teens. She was the secretary of the Sabbath School. And then, of course, there's the literature evangelist, William Arnold, and finally the printer, Henry Scott. And those 2 and Stephen Haskell came as bachelors. So they set out. And when they set out from San Francisco, and the date was the 10th of May. They got on board a steamship, the Australia, and they arrived here a little later. For example, when they arrived in Sydney, it was the 6th of June, so a little less than a month it took them to travel. They had stopped at Auckland on the way and had a little bit of time to suss out things in Auckland, because Stephen Haskell had a desire. In fact, he did before 12 months was out. He went back to Auckland and started the mission in New Zealand as well. And so they arrived here in Sydney, but the rest of the party, apart from Steve Haskell and I think it was John Corliss, they stayed in Sydney for a little extra time because they wanted to suss out for a future mission what they could do and where they could do it here in Sydney. But they decided that it was going to be Melbourne where they would start, because they had quite some good contacts that had already been established in Melbourne, and they wanted to go down there and try and build on those contacts. So, apart from Haskell and Corliss, the rest of them hopped on the boat, the Wentworth, and they headed down to Melbourne and arrived at Melbourne on the 9th of June. It was wet. It was cold. It was a wintry Melbourne welcome that they received, and that's how the next 6 months they just kept describing it and complaining about the weather. Maybe they had reason to do that, I don't know. And the other part that was cold was the reception from the people of Melbourne. They were kind of known as these Yankee religious group that are trying to convert us, and the ministers of the local churches were putting articles in the paper, and they were getting a lot of flack from the local people there in Melbourne as well. So it wasn't all easy, all right? But what happens next? Yes, they arrived there, and before the 17th of June had arrived, the other 2 members had arrived by train, and so on the 17th of June they moved into Sumalide in Richmond, and there was a dwelling that most of them were able to live in, and we'll look at shortly how many did and where the others went. And then on the 4th of July, so it was a couple of weeks after they had settled in, that they held the first official meeting, which was a Sabbath school, and the minutes are recorded. So it's great to have those primary sources and to be able to get into the story that way. This is Sumalide. the house where they congregated, most of them. You can see here that it was called 46 Hyatt Street in Richmond, but it's today called 64. In fact, I actually Googled just yesterday. I thought, I wonder if the house has changed or it's been demolished and they built something else on site. Block of towers, maybe. But no, it's still the same house. A lot of trees covering up now, and it didn't make a good picture, so I didn't get you something up to date. But this is a photograph, and the wall, for example, still exists, and the structure of the house as we see it at the front is still the same. And this is where the Israel family, so Pastor Israel, his wife, and their 2 children, remember they're the older children, the teenage children, and also the 3 bachelors, Haskell, and back to my list again for their names, of course, William Arnold, the literature evangelist, and Henry Scott. That's where they all lived in there. And this home not only became their home for, well, not all of them. As I said, Haskell moved out before the rest of them did when he went to New Zealand, but it remained their home base. It was also their administrative centre for the mission in Victoria, or in Australia really at that stage. And it also became, as we've noted, on the 4th of July in 1885. That gives us 140 years, 1 month ago. That's amazing, isn't it? I hope in 10 years' time, this date doesn't escape without some great celebration for the 150th anniversary of our first meeting in Australia. And it was a Sabbath School meeting. It's worthwhile remembering. So let's go on and have a look at this story. As we said, we've just mentioned that, and I popped that in just to get our bearings on it again. But what actually happened was when they arrived, as I've already indicated to you, they had a very cold reception. They decided that they were wanting to do tent missions, but they said, we're not running a tent mission, they're all going to freeze, so will we. So they decided, well, we'll go and look at the halls. And halls were between £5 and £25. Couldn't afford that. And so they decided they'd do door-to-door work. And just visit the contacts and the leads that they had from people who'd been receiving the signs of the times, etc. And so that's where it all began. And in going door to door, it was a cold reception that they received from people, and they were knocked back again and again and again. The literature evangelist, for example, after 5 weeks hadn't sold 1 book. Imagine what that would be like, how discouraging that would be. And then finally, Corliss, the evangelist, I mean, he's ready to preach. And there's not an audience yet to preach to. So he decides that on one day he was coming home from trying to give out the tracts and the leaflets. The story goes, he slams the leaflet down on a spike, and this fence, by the way, is still standing in Melbourne. It's noted on the street where this was. He slams this leaflet down on the spike of the fence and said, may somebody get that one and read that one, and moved on. Well, it was a discouraging time. For example, when they shall I tell the rest of that story? Let me just jump ahead and tell you the rest of that story. The rest of that story is that eventually that leaflet was actually picked up, and it was picked up by a man by the name of Walter Miller, who was a publisher, printer, and he had a friend called John Woods, and they belonged to a debating society. And he picked this up, and it was on the topic of the Sabbath. And he thought, wow, this would make a really good debate. And he tracked the track down and got on to Corliss, eventually was the man that he managed to get onto. Oh, by the way, I didn't mention, Corliss and his wife and family didn't live in Summerlide. They actually were around a couple of corners in another smaller, cheaper house than the one that the others had, and they just wanted to be a little bit separate from the group, and that was fine. So Corliss got the message, yep, you want a debate? I'll be the chairman for you. He volunteered to be a chairman. So they had a great debate. Miller took the position, Saturday's the Sabbath, and Woods took the position, no, Sunday. And at the end of the debate, guess what? Corliss was able to sum it up, and it took him 2 hours. And you can imagine the response of that. In fact, from that, eventually, a lot of those original contacts, including both Miller and Woods, became Adventists. Their names are on the minute book when they joined the Sabbath School group, etc. And they became influential in bringing many others in. But it was kind of not in the first month, as it would seem, maybe not the second month even, but a bit further down the track, that begins to happen, because in the meantime it seems that their faith was tested. Finally, Paulus couldn't help himself any longer. He said, I've got to preach. I'm an evangelist. And so they hired out this hall, which is interesting, actually. This hall, known as the former Temperance Hall, eventually the Australian Conference was formed here in 1888 in this hall, and it was used by them as their office as well for a period of time. But the years prior to that, it was used by these missionaries who had come to Australia. And so we find that Paulus decides he's going to break the ice, and he's going to go and actually run an evangelistic program. So he advertised, and we actually have his wife kept a record of all the people who came along. And on the first night, 40 people turned up, included the team. And then the question was the Easter question. That was the topic. Then Daniel 7 was the next 2 nights later. Less turned up was the language. And then there was the 2,300 days, fewer still. And it just kept going down and down until finally, and by the way, Haskell took one, and there was a big dip after he took his topic on the judgment. And then at the final meeting, the 3 angels' messages, only 3 people were there with the actual team. And so they decided to give it a miss, and they cancelled the program and just continued following up interest from that campaign. So they really had a bad run. They couldn't get their teeth really into it. But I tell you what, this is where they got their teeth into it. Now, you can't read this, but these are some of the minutes, and this is where I've only got a couple of minutes just to share a couple of things here with you, and I'm going to just go over, most people seem to be on this side. These are the minutes of the first 4 Sabbaths and the Sabbath School. So you'll notice up the top there, July 4 right at the top was that first Sabbath, July 11, July 18, July 10, etc. And you will notice that it says this is the first meeting of the Seventh-day Adventist Sabbath School that was held on the above date, the 4th of July. And then Elder Haskell presided. He was the organiser. He called the Sabbath School together. And he presides. He takes the lesson. He organises everything. And then notice the next paragraph says, on account of a misunderstanding on the part of some, all were not present at the opening of the school. It was decided to commence school in the future promptly at 10 o'clock. Now, that is a loaded statement, because guess who would be the people who were late coming to the first Sabbath school? Not the people who lived in the house, but the people who lived around the corner. So this is a slap at the face of Paulus's. Come on, get your act together, get here every week. At the starting time, we'll compromise, we won't start till 10 o'clock. And so that's interesting. Now I see another bit of human nature comes out here. At the close of the recitation, that's the lesson, the following officers were elected. By suggestion of Elder Israel, Brother Scott is the one who was elected as the superintendent, and Jesse Israel was elected as the church secretary or the Sabbath school secretary. So here we can see, okay, Haskell's got in, he's organised it and run the first program, but Israel says, hey, we all want to be involved in this, so gets the printer. He was the one who was put in as a superintendent, and he was the superintendent for all the time that these minutes were being written, so he must have done a good job. Later, John Stockton, he is appointed as the assistant, etc. And so it goes on. I also find, and I think I've got this one, if I can get it here. This might be able to read this one. It says, that was the one that I should have had up for you to read. Let's go to this one. I think this is interesting, and we'd better stop on this, but there is a lot more that could be said yet. Notice the section here that has been highlighted. It says, our numbers was increased by the addition of Brother J. Stockton, who has recently commenced keeping the Sabbath and has his 2 children. We are grateful to that they have their addition, to our numbers. So this is interesting because in all the minutes, and by the way, the minutes is not only week by week like this, you've got summaries of all the office bearers. You've got summaries of all the teachers of the Sabbath School classes. You've got summaries of all the participants, literally every participant who walked in that door. And it grew from the original 10, as you might have noticed. Now we're up to 13 with the Stocktons there. And so we've got this story. Now, can I just, as I said, I have to finish on this, but as I said to Donna, if you really want me to finish the whole story on another occasion, I'll come and do that because there's a lot more to be said. But let me give you the Stockton story. John Stockton was a coach builder. For example, the governor of Victoria, he was a patron of John Stockton. So it was obviously quality coaches that he built. He had quite a reputation, a great business going. And he was a person who had been receiving the signs from a namesake back in America, and they decided, well, let's follow that name up. And so in visiting, inviting them to come along to Sabbath School, and would you believe, after this day, he stayed until midnight. What time does it start? 10 o'clock Saturday morning. And he stayed until midnight talking about, discussing, and just having a great mind-blowing experience. And his 2 boys, now I don't know if they stayed with him the whole time, but his 2 boys came with him as well. And as you look at the rest of the story, Stockton was the first, let's say family, but him as an individual, he was the first one to be entered on the list as a member outside the original group. He is the first one to be listed as the first office bearer apart from the original group. He was the assistant superintendent to Scott with the Sabbath School. And he was the first baptism that they experienced there in Victoria. And we can continue on. He just in so many ways, he is the first one outside the original group. I think I mentioned that became a Sabbath School teacher, etc. And he just made such a contribution and brought in with him a great family. So look, the big thing that I want to say with this, in part of the records here, it actually shows every single person who turned up is counted in as being part of the church or the Sabbath School roll. I love the way there's 3 pages of the listing of every name of people who joined the Sabbath School program. And then you've got a column over here that indicates whether they stayed or left. Some were removed. The Corlises were removed because he eventually went off to South Australia and opened up things in South Australia. And then there were others who had left the truth, and it's amazing how many down there have left the truth. Have not returned, etc. Just a little statement to that effect. But in 15 months, while these minutes covered the beginning of our first Sabbath School in Australia, the number had gone in 6 months from 10 to 50. And in the next few months leading up to the end of, I think it was about October or nearabouts in that second year, that 15 months after the starting of it, their numbers had grown a total of 150 attended the Sabbath School, but now take away those people who were listed as left the truth or removed or whatever, there was, I think, 98 was the number of people attending that Sabbath School, and most of them by this stage baptised and become very, very active. This was the successful part of the Australian mission. It was later on when tent missions were started, etc., that we see another big jump. But nothing else seemed to be working except the Sabbath School. You know, it was the point where people were coming in. And I guess for me, I get a bit sad sometimes when I go back and look at history like this and realise, wow, you know, so many people are missing out on a real blessing from the Sabbath School time.